everyone, and welcome back to another Rockies Daily. I'm your host, Scott Ayers, where we're talking all things Colorado Rockies. We've made it through the weekend, and I'm recording here kind of at the end of Sunday. The Rockies are currently trailing the Rangers 9-5, but I figured this was the perfect time to record. I've got a lot to talk about. We've got a lot to talk about. We're just about done with 3 games here to start this spring training preseason. And some definitely some different takeaways. And look, to preface, I think we all understand that in spring training, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. There are underlying stories in spring training or going into spring training that can kind of have a case be built for them, right? And I'll get to kind of what that means in our first topic. But at the end of the day, if a guy goes 5 for 5 in a spring training game, your takeaway isn't going to be like, oh, this guy is, he's the next Aaron Judge or the next blank. Same as if a pitcher has a really bad outing, the first takeaway isn't, oh, well, this guy's washed and he's screwed. Unless it's, and just long story short, I say unless there is a guy like Antonio Senzatella, which isn't how I planned on transitioning and starting this show. And again, spring training can only mean so much. And if a guy has a bad outing, so be it. Senzatella gets the nod for the first game, preseason spring training game for the Rockies. Pitch gives you 2 innings, gives up a home run to our good friend Nolan Arenado on a meatball of a slider. And it was fitting that was Arenado hitting the home run. But ultimately, the reason why I kind of started the show with that is, look, if it was Victor Vodnik, who actually struggled today against the Rangers, he has a bad outing. He's trying new pitches. So be it. I still feel confident in Vodnik. The difference is with Senzatella is that confidence is really gone in the public eye for Rockies fans. There's a reason why he's being most likely subjected to the bullpen as an arm. Just to eat some innings. That's really what his career has come down to. And look, there was some reactions online worried that Senzatella was going to be the guy. That goes back to, hey, let's take a deep breath. Jimmy Herget got the start against the Rangers. He's going to be in the bullpen. It would be malpractice if Antonio Senzatella was that number 5 starter, and I just don't see that happening. I think there's other guys that the Rockies have, multiple names that the Rockies have that are ahead of Senzatella, and I don't really think there's anything Senzatella can do in this spring to find himself as a rotation guy. That would have to be earned somewhat in the season, probably due to injuries, and even with that, right, like I've got Feltner, Dollander, and Tanner Gordon as all just surefire locks of guys I'd for sure put over Senzatella at this point. And just to touch on a little more on Senzatella, it's obviously a bit of a bummer just because he's been with the Rockies so long. And he's on this extension that does expire after this season. Team option in 2027. It's hard to believe that the Rockies would want to bring him back unless he can have a resurgence in 2026. Which it just doesn't really feel like that. One of the interesting things to note, though, is we saw Senzatella toss about 8 sinker pitches, which, to note, is crazy because in 2025, we saw him use the sinker a total of about 20 times. He used that pitch 0.9% of the time. He's really just a fastball pitcher. The four-seam is what he uses about just a little over 50% of the time. So he's obviously trying new stuff, and that's kind of what we see from these different pitchers in spring training. They're trying different things, and that could be a strategy from Alan Leichman and co. Is, hey, we're going to try different approaches and different pitches, and that sinker could be one of those options. So that was the downside, I think, to that first game. But man, everyone behind him looked really good. Guys that are actually going to be pitching, Meja, Agnes, Pettit, Peralta, and Sullivan, all giving you scoreless innings. And those are all look like strong arms from their first appearances. And again, it's just one sample size, but one of the things that we've talked about is this bullpen, I think, is going to be a lot stronger than what is probably seen at the national level. I don't suspect a lot of people are going to be talking about this Rockies bullpen, but they've looked good through now 3 games from the guys that we expect to play at the major league level. I understand that the Rockies lost that first regular or spring training game 3-2 in a blown lead, but ultimately, I don't really care because it was from a guy that is probably not going to be at the major league level. And yeah, so that's one of the big things to note. In their first 2 games against the Diamondbacks, they gave up some runs. They had some pretty bad errors. Cole Carrig had 2 errors that we will talk a little bit about for the Rocks hitting. But ultimately, you look at a lot of these guys, and you feel pretty good about the guys early on. Again, it's just early impressions in all of this, and I know I'm stressing that. But just remind yourself, after a good or a bad spring training game, ultimately, what matters is kind of what we're seeing in some of these positional battles that are mainly on the lineup side of things. But for that 5th starting position, one of the names is Tanner Gordon. And he gave you obviously just an inning pitch, but 3 strikeouts for Gordon. His velocity was up, but he had a different approach in every at-bat. And obviously that's common, but it's refreshing to see him use, obviously, his fastball, slider, and changeup. And each at-bat looked very different in terms of the catalog of pitches he was using. So for Gordon, he feels like a bit of an outside chance, at least to start this season, as a rotation guy. But I really think he has a great opportunity to find his way into the rotation. There's obviously some vets in front of him, but they're not vets that are Cy Young-esque, right? They are guys. Sugano is probably the biggest question mark, and I'm interested to see what his first appearance at Coors Field will look like. Spring, he's getting ready for the World Baseball Classic, but I want to see what Coors Field looks like for someone that struggled in a more pitcher-friendly ballpark with the Orioles. Now he's in a place where, he gave up 31 home runs last year, I believe. I mean, there's a chance he breaks a record for how many home runs he gives up if he makes it all the way through the season. So that's what I mean for Gordon, for Feltner, for Dollander. They're all competing for that 5th spot. But as the season opens up, there's a chance for all of them to be in that rotation, right? So, I'm kind of going on and on, but I do really like to see, these relievers come out strong. Jaden Hill, Gabriel Hughes, Carson Palmquist all gave you shutout innings. Again, more of these relievers that are throwing very hard, and ultimately feel pretty confident about. Again, Vodnik struggled today, and really in his appearance, he fell behind. He walked his first batter, gave up a single. And then sac fly and a ground ball were the results of the 2 earned runs. So for Vodnik, I feel fine. I would not be worried about Victor Vodnik. Just an appearance first appearance of the spring. But ultimately, pitching-wise, we kind of touched on the biggest positional battle in that starting rotation. And for the bullpen, Sensatella is currently listed as a guy who's going to be the bullpen, but he's going to have to prove something. He's going to have to prove something in the spring. So let's move on, though, to the hitting of this team. And this is where it's really interesting to me. Pitching is interesting. Don't get me wrong. I'm a seam head, right? That's what we call ourselves, guys who love pitching. But let's talk about some of the different positional battles that we're currently seeing. And look, there were some positive signs in these last few games. Brenton Doyle in that second game against Arizona goes 3 for 3 with a couple of RBIs. Obviously great. In that same game, Charlie Condon looked very comfortable and very confident at the plate. And he is part of that positional battle at first that we will touch on. Jordan Beck against the Rangers today. I'm saying today, this is obviously for Monday's show. I'm recording kind of as this Rangers game is winding down. Goes 2 for 3. I mean, look, in Kyle Karros as well, going 3 for 3. On top of that, if you put money on Adele Amador being the guy who gets the first home run of spring training for the Rockies, I'd call you crazy, but he goes 1 for 4 with a bomb. And then Ritter, Castro, and Tovar, all with hits, all with RBIs. And what does this all mean? And finally, Cole Carrig had a triple. But unfortunately for Carrig, he has 2 errors that resulted in runs scored for the Diamondbacks. But I know all these different guys because one of the big things coming into this year are these batters having some confidence. And that is one thing that you can take from the spring and transition into the regular season. Now, look, you're going to be facing some relievers that are essentially pitching underhand, right? But it doesn't matter in the sense of just growing that confidence and having confidence in each plate appearance. And being able to transition that from obviously some of these guys you're facing to the major league level, and for when the season actually starts. But with these position battles, it's just all very interesting. The big one is obviously first base, and it feels like a bit of a crapshoot. Blaine Krim 0 for 3. Edward Julian went 1 for 4 today. I think he's like 1 for 5, 1 for 6 total. TJ Rumfield is looking for a hit. Troy Johnson is looking for a hit. Not a lot of life in the bats right now from the first base position outside Charlie Condon. So that first base battle is probably the most interesting because it feels like it's also maybe the weakest position group on maybe the entire roster. And so you kind of look down the line here in mid-February. You hope to see a little life at the first base position. But ultimately, if these bats just struggle all throughout spring, which I don't think they will, but if they struggle all throughout spring, that's why you bring in some of these different utility guys. And that's where the Rockies can be creative even on opening day. And it's something we've noted on, but maybe if he's healthy, Tyler Freeman, who we expect to have back soon, maybe he's the guy at first, and maybe Ritter's at second, and Kyle Karros is at third. Those are the different things that the Rockies will be able to play with and mess with. Cole Carrig obviously showed off his bat a little, but one of the things the Rockies can't have is poor fielding. The margin of error is already so thin for the Rockies. And it's a spring training game, so it doesn't really matter to have a couple errors. But it does in a sense because if you're in a game and the Rockies are up 3-1, and there's a couple guys on base and you get something knocked to short or to third, you're overthrowing the guy at first, or you're trying to turn 2 and you overthrow the guy at second, the game completely flips on its head. And those are scenarios that exist, and the Rockies just have to be good in the field. They have to be good. They were not good enough last year. They were bad in the field last year. And so for Carrig, that triple gets kind of wiped away by a couple of just bad errors. And so that's just another thing to follow as we move on in spring training is not only how are the bats looking and how are these at bats and are they drawing out long at bats, but how are they doing in the field? Especially this infield. The outfield feels like it's fairly set. McCarthy hasn't hit really well, all too well yet to start in spring, but he feels like he's going to be the third guy with Beck and Doyle. And so this infield, though, feels wide open, and it should be. And this is why you are happy with the front office making some different signings and trades, because this competition just should breed the talent to start to rise, right? Can Zach Veen find himself on this opening day roster? And then along with some of these other names that we've mentioned. So competition will be interesting. I say Zach Veen. I know we're talking about the infield, but Zach Veen just is another name, though, that we will be following, right? He's had a huge transformation. How does that transformation continue, though, at the plate, in the outfield? It just will be really interesting, though, in terms of who's going to have confidence to start the season, and what the Rockies what the Rockies do. So that's kind of the piece I leave you with. If you're able to watch games or listen to them, just try to track some of these different position battles because they are very interesting. And I don't think decisions should be made up until really season starts, and maybe obviously a little before season. But I say that mainly highlighting Edward Julian, who has been kind of the name as the guy who's locked at starting at first or maybe second. I'm not sold on him, and I am not sold that he should be the guy that's starting for the Rockies. But I don't hate that the Rockies went after him. I don't hate giving him an opportunity. But ultimately, we'll just have to wait and see for someone like that has had such a tremendous slump. It's bigger than a slump because it's now been multiple seasons. But that's why we have spring training, so we can talk about some of these stories, get some of the different interesting insights into what to expect and what to hope for. Finally, let's end with just some weekend news. Rhys Hoskins finally has a home. He has signed with the Guardians. And this comes a week after Nathaniel Lowe signed a minor league contract with the Reds. And why I note that is the Rockies had been mentioned for both of those names. They decided to stick with what they've got. And it's interesting that first base market is now pretty much dry. Justin Turner is probably the best available in terms of overall WAR at like 0.9. And it's only of note if the Rockies want to try and get a first baseman. Free agency just is pretty bleak. Maybe you look the route of making a deal, a trade somewhere. What that looks like, I don't necessarily know. But just to know, if you're looking at your TV, you're frustrated, man, first base is bad. Don't look really in free agency. Maybe look at making a deal, but I don't think the Rockies are there. I think that's a ways away to even consider, but just something to note for the first baseman market. Freddie Freeman, he says he wants to retire in 4 years and with the LA Dodgers. So if you ever thought, hey, maybe Freeman will have a homecoming and leave LA and maybe weaken that team a little, don't keep thinking about that. That is probably a dead dream. And it's probably a dead dream on arrival, but just something to know. And then Bo Bichette, one of the final names we'll talk about, a name that we mentioned early on in the show as a fun prospect for the Rockies to look at is... Oh, my audio went out for a second. Is playing third base this year for the Mets. And look, it was just one appearance. Had a nice throw over to first that was not on target. And ultimately, why do I bring it up is the Mets and the Dodgers are very similar in spending power, but it just feels like the Dodgers are a little bit more methodical than the New York Mets. It just blows me away. We'll see what Bichette can do at third, but in reality, it feels weird to sign a guy with that much money spent and have him play out of position. It's just weird, man. It's just weird, and I'm sure he'll figure it out. Bichette's obviously an extremely talented player, but I cheer against these teams that spend $1 gazillion and can't figure it out. So cheer against the Dodgers. You better believe I cheer against the New York Mets as well. But with that, that's kind of a weekend recap. This show, almost 20 minutes long, but I'm going to keep it under 20 minutes for you because I know you're probably thinking, man, I just want to get back to work. I want to be doing this 9 to 5, and I just only had 19 and a half minutes to listen to Rockies Daily. Well, you're in luck because I'm going to end right before 19 and a half minutes. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful Monday. Go Rockies as always, and I will see you tomorrow.